So thank you all for coming, and thank you to the panellists, of course, and to Amnesty for allowing me the use of this auditorium. I'm a country coordinator at Amnesty and the organiser of this event. I bring this discussion to the organisation as an individual that has become clear in the realisation that all we really have is activism and truth speakers. Anger is a gift. It's a sign that you're alive. Anger is an energy that we can use to change the narrative. A narrative that still keeps far too many sleepwalking through life. This anger isn't the empty, divisive, misguided anger that drives the fascist lackeys of the elite. The anger that we feel is driven by love. Love for humanity, truth, and clarity. As so-called Western democracy metamorphosizes into global authoritarianism on steroids, question the timeline they would like you to adhere to. Question the doubt they have sowed in your mind, and believe in your capacity to affect change. I just want to say that Amnesty is a politically neutral organisation. Okay. Enjoy the panel.
Thanks. Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm a bit taller. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. I am chairing this meeting, this important meeting. My name's Crispin Flintoff. Thank you, Mum. I'm pleased that we've got such a great panel here tonight to talk about this, and I am very confused. I don't know about you, but I'm very confused about what's going on in the Middle East, and with not only with just the Middle East, but then Trump on top of it. It just seems like I really don't know what's happening. So this is very important to me to uncover what might be going on and what might be happening in the future. I'll just introduce the panellists. We have sitting next to me, we have Laleh Khalili, who's Professor of Gulf Studies at the University of Exeter. She's formerly a Professor of Middle Eastern Politics at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and a Professor of International Politics at Queen Mary University of London. A round of applause for Laleh. And also joining us, we've got next to her, Andrew Feinstein. The atmosphere is electric here. He's a South African former politician, activist, filmmaker, campaigner and author who specialises in the investigation of the arms trade and the corruption that accompanies it. Now, the person next to Andrew, I don't know if you've seen him before. It might be new to you. He's Jeremy Corbyn. I don't have a blurb for him, so all I'll say is former leader of the Labour Party. Is that quite a good one? And campaigner for peace and in the peace and justice campaign. So Jeremy Corbyn. And finally, we've got a great panelist, Matt Kennard. Author and journalist, previously the head of investigations at the investigative journalism website Declassified UK, which he co-founded with author and historian Mark Curtis. So these are your panellists. So we're going to do some questions at the end, so you can all chip in then. I'll probably forget to ask something really important, and you can do it then instead of me, okay? But to start with, I'm really disturbed by what's been happening in the last 24 hours, not really reported on mainstream news. We had all this optimism, perhaps, that there was a ceasefire in Gaza, but we've just seen bombing of the Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank, and I haven't, in my mind, seen bombing of the West Bank before. So the fact that that's going on kind of makes me think that this ceasefire is not such a great dawn of anything positive. So I'm just wondering if any of the panellists would you like to say what's happening on that? Yeah.
I think it's really important to acknowledge that while the ceasefire holds in Gaza, actually Israel continues to bomb Gaza as well. So not just Jenin, not just southern Lebanon, where they occupied a whole bunch of different villages and are continuing, despite a ceasefire with Lebanon, also to destroy villages there. But they started an operation with the collaboration, and I think this is also really important to acknowledge, of the Palestinian Authority, which has pretty much sold itself to Israel. In the West Bank. So the operation that they have started is especially in the refugee camp of Jenin, which has a long and storied history as a place where people have self-organized. And in fact, part of that self-organization has been essentially groups of young men that have gathered up together, and they're not necessarily connected to Fatah, they're not connected to Hamas or the PA or any of the political organizations, but there's now autonomous organization going on where they're trying to protect and defend their communities. And this is actually really pretty scary, not only to the state of Israel, but also to the Palestinian Authority, which is why before the current operations were launched by Israel, which has included bombing, blowing up houses, actually bulldozing down streets, attacking hospitals in what has become completely and totally familiar in every single place that Israel goes fighting. But before all of this started, actually, Palestinian Authority security forces were going around in Jenin and elsewhere and arresting people. So there is something afoot here in which the quislings of the Palestinian Authority, who are essentially subcontractors of security for the state of Israel, are involved. Now, what Israel is trying to do in Jenin is it is trying to neutralize, in a language that they have used, Palestinian activists within the camp, but they are also there in support of the settlers who are becoming, I mean, they have always been emboldened, but they are especially emboldened. They've put up, in most recent months, they've put up massive billboards in Arabic showing pictures from the 1948 Nakba of Palestinians leaving. And essentially in Arabic it says, there's no future for you in Palestine. And they're asking people to leave. And so these activities that Israel is undertaking in Jenin and elsewhere, Tulkarem and Khalili, has to be seen as part of that process, which has essentially been in operation since 1948 and before, where expulsions, bombings, destruction have been part of the order of the day and part of Israel's settler colonial activism.
What do you make of what's happened this week, Andrew? What's your take on the ceasefire and then these attacks? Or the so-called ceasefire, sorry.
I think the ceasefire was primarily an attempt by Donald Trump to show that he is more of a statesman than Joe Biden. Being more of a statesman than a corpse is no great achievement, first of all. Second of all, I think it's quite important to bear in mind that Trump, who I'm sure everybody in this room thinks is incredibly odious and everything else, which he is, can't be any worse than Joe Biden. I mean, Joe Biden is the person who has been providing the bulk of the weaponry into the slaughter in Gaza. The blood of every single Palestinian murdered is on Joe Biden's hands. How does one get worse than that? Yes, of course, he's already doing things in the United States of America in a far less polite way than the Democrats oppress marginalized communities. He does them overtly. He targets groups that the Democrats might not target, especially on issues around gender and sexual rights. But when it comes to foreign policy, the fact that there was even this desire to give the sort of pretense of a ceasefire is more than Biden or Starmer or any of the Western leaders has bothered to do. I think we have to see this in a slightly broader context. And that is the reality that the so-called West, the global North, with very few exceptions, has decided to eviscerate the international rule of law that was established in the wake of the Holocaust. The notion for them is never again for white people who we like. And I think this is very, very serious. By continuing to sell weapons into this conflict, which has rent asunder the notion that we have arms export controls, that we have any international rule of law, they're effectively saying we're prepared to make the world a totally anarchic and lawless place for everybody in order to protect Israel. Now, why would they do that? Because Israel is really the poster child of the racist, white supremacist, colonial mentality of so much of today's global North. And by drawing back, we would acknowledge the nature of our own politics. And Israel is to a large extent the poster child of that ethno-nationalism. And the irony of the moment, and it's a particular irony for me to say this as a Jew, it's a particular irony for me to say this given the person I'm sitting next to on my left, is that if we look at the world today, besides our own governments, which I believe are racist, who are some of Israel's biggest allies? Narendra Modi, whose entire political philosophy is based on racism and anti-Semitism, and Viktor Orban, who despite being an out-and-out anti-Semite, is welcomed in Israel with full state honors at least once a year. This is the madness of the moment we're enduring. So sadly and tragically, the events of the last week haven't surprised me. They've depressed me. But let me end by actually continuing from something that Nili said in her introduction. Chris Hedges, in the film of a book of mine called The Shadow World, quotes Augustine, and he says, Augustine said, "Hope has two beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they don't remain the way they are." There has never been a time when more of us need to show courage. Thanks.
What's happened in the past week, Jeremy?
I would. And first of all, thanks to Amnesty for giving us the space this evening. It's great, and thank you all for being here today. I was at The Hague this weekend, where we were launching the Hague Convention, which has been signed by 9 member states of the UN, and essentially it is one of adherence to the international legal decisions concerning Israel's behavior in Gaza and the West Bank, and obviously supporting the Palestinian people. And it was put together by Progressive International, of which I'm an extremely active member, and the idea was that we build up a serious body of opinion with, within governments around the world. And so, as I said, we've got 9 signed up to it already, who are going to stay the course and stick with Palestine, however difficult and however long that road is. And so it's essentially a sort of Palestinian group within the UN, and I think a lot of credit goes to Progressive International team for negotiating this thing over the past several months. Actually, it's taken to do it. We're expecting a number of other governments to join. We're looking at Ireland, we're looking at Norway, we're looking at a number of others, but we're very pleased that we've got Malaysia and a number of others in at the very beginning. Second point, I was watching Al Jazeera, and targeted bombardment of a car in northern Gaza yesterday. Straight down like that. Killed all the occupants of the car. And they interviewed, or there was an interview online with the driver of the car that was travelling behind, that was carrying people back to their wrecked homes in Gaza. And he just said it came from nowhere. This thing came out of the sky and just destroyed all life in that car. And the death toll, recorded death toll, has now risen to 64,000. That's on top. That's 64,000 in total. Add on the numbers more that are going to be found, the more the rubble is cleared. And then the pictures of the bombing of Jenin by Israeli forces over the past couple of days. But then, to me, what was very sad was Al Jazeera opened their news report on this by saying we're not allowed to report directly from Israel or from the Palestine territories because they've been banned by both Israel and the Palestine Authority. For goodness sake, lift the ban on Al Jazeera. They're the ones that have been giving us the news and the reality of what's happening all across the region. There's so much more to say, except that I think the danger is that Israel does not withdraw from Gaza, that keeps troops there. There are still quite a lot there already, I suspect, and keeps going back in, because the clear aim of the right in Israeli politics is to occupy Gaza and expel the population into Egypt. That hasn't worked so far, but no doubt they'll carry on doing it. But the limited ceasefire in Gaza has freed up a huge amount of military capacity for Israel to now intensify its operations on the West Bank. And I think you're right, I cannot recall a recent past when Israel used air attacks in the West Bank. This seems to me to be a wholly new departure onto that Jenin camp. The Jenin camp has been under siege for a very long time, with a dispute with the Palestinian Authority and now being bombed by Israel. And so the question for us is, it's not for us to tell the Palestinian people what to say or what to do. We're here in solidarity with them, but we are here to tell our own government and the US government and others what they should do, and Andrew's absolutely right. This country has poured weapons into Israel for decades and decades. Those planes can only fly because of parts that are made in Britain. Those bombs can only be dropped because they're delivered largely via RAF Akrotiri to Israel to bomb the places in the West Bank and in Gaza. So when the history books are finally written, decades hence, hopefully by that time there'll be a recognized free Palestinian entity, state, they're going to say, well, actually, who were the people that occasioned the bombing that killed all these people? But I notice there's now a big build-up of antagonism towards Iran, and hardly any reporting I've found on the BBC or most of the newspapers that Iran, over the past few weeks, has reopened the nuclear negotiations with a view to returning to the nuclear deal they had before. So the excuse of attacking Iran because of its alleged development of nuclear weapons is something that is deeply undermined by the actions of Iran itself. Now, I'm not here to defend the human rights record of any government, but I am here to say that a war with Iran will be catastrophic for the people of Iran and the people of the whole region, and that is what's being ratcheted up to at the present time. So, yes, welcome the ceasefire insofar as it's gone, but don't take our eyes away from the need for increased activity in support of the rights of the Palestinian people. They've already lost hundreds of thousands over the years, and you've seen the results now in Gaza of the more recent bombardment. It's international solidarity that will help to bring about long-term peace for the Palestinian people, and recognize there are some, not very many perhaps, but there are people in Israel who very bravely have also stood up in support of the Palestinian people and against the occupation. They should be thanked and recognised as well.
Matt, I'm just from what I've heard, I'm just thinking the ceasefire, people are saying we've got the ceasefire. We're hearing it on the media from people like Sadiq Khan, I think the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, saying you've got your ceasefire, you don't need any more of these demonstrations. And the fact the BBC have not reported what happened in Jenin, it's like they don't want that information to get out there. So with that in mind, I mean, what do you think about the last week? Is this an attempt to have a kind of just keep going into Palestine but not let anyone talk about it and not discuss it?
Thanks a lot, Crispin, and it's good to be here with you all and this great panel. On the last week, I mean, to be honest with you, when the ceasefire was announced and it took effect the day before Trump was inaugurated, I was highly suspicious because obviously Trump does not have Palestine or Palestinians' interests at heart. So I was thinking, what has he negotiated with Netanyahu for this to take place before he becomes president? And I think the answer to that is what we're seeing. Some deal was made where he said, look, I don't want this going on when I'm inaugurated, but the larger plan you have to take over the West Bank, to basically run Gaza under some PA-style administration, and to take out Iran eventually, probably, was part of the deal. Because, in my opinion, Netanyahu, when October 7th happened, about a week after, he went to South Israel to meet with mayors who were in the places near the border with Gaza. And he said to them, look, I know what's happened is terrible, but remain steadfast, we're going to change the Middle East. And I think he meant that. He saw October 7th as a 9/11 moment. You know, after 9/11, there's that famous quote from someone who was in the Pentagon at the time, and he said he went into the Pentagon and they said, right, we're going to take out 5 countries in 5 years: Syria, Libya, Iraq, Iran. They didn't get to do all of them. They did most of them, actually. But I think Netanyahu basically saw October 7th in that way, and I think he still does. So, and actually, interestingly, I think that what's happened in Gaza is an amazing victory for humanity, because you had 3 nuclear-armed powers, Britain, US, and Israel, basically throwing everything they could at a 2.3 million population, half of them kids, in a prison, and they were defeated. They killed a lot of people, but I believe their original goal was to depopulate northern Gaza. They called it the Netzarim corridor, you know, that divided Gaza in half, just south of Gaza City. I think their original goal was, we're going to pummel them so hard that they'll leave. And the Palestinians bravely and heroically didn't leave, a lot of them. Hundreds of thousands of them stayed. And then they launched an extermination campaign in Jabalia at the end of last year, where there were no journalists were even allowed to report, because they killed them all and they stopped the signal being allowed. And it failed. And you saw the images on the day of the ceasefire and in the last week of all the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians returning to their home. So I think Palestine defied the empire in that sense and won. But the other parts, the other elements of the grand program for the Middle East are going to play out. And obviously Netanyahu knows that in Trump he's got a lackey, because if you look at Trump's cabinet, his ambassador is Mike Huckabee, who's a lunatic Christian Zionist. Mark Rubio, another fanatical Zionist, is Secretary of State. Steve Witkoff is his envoy, who's a fanatical Zionist. So there's no way these people aren't collaborating, talking to the Netanyahu administration about doing all the things they wanted to do for years. I think that the biggest part of it all will be an attack on Iran. I think that's inevitable, because the other thing is Trump's not going to have a second term. They've got 4 years to get everything done. Trump in his first administration cancelled the nuclear deal that the Obama administration had negotiated. So, and also if you listen to the rhetoric of Netanyahu and people, they always link everything that's happening to Iran. They say that's the head of the octopus. You've got the Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, everything is about Iran. So I think that's all coming. But again, this is the program they have. These are the aims they have. But as the Palestinians have showed, resistance and defiance can defeat these powers. They're not very good at what they do. Look what Israel, Israel, the only thing it achieved was killing a lot of people and turning the whole world against it. They didn't achieve any of their goals. And people are aware of what Israel is in a way they never have been. They're aware of what Zionism is. We're talking about things that we weren't allowed to talk about for years, like the Israel lobby. Anyone could talk about that now. So these are all things that in the long term are going to damage Israel's ability to project power and continue the occupation as long as they want. And the other thing is that's been mentioned by the other panelists is the role of the Palestinian Authority. That's another thing that people didn't talk about before and wasn't as exposed as it is now. But if you talk about what's happening in Jenin with Operation Iron Wall, which is an interesting phrase to term the operation as well, because Iron Wall it's a phrase that comes from an essay by Vladimir Jabotinsky, who's kind of the intellectual godfather of Likudnik Zionism. And this essay called The Iron Wall, he basically said, look, we're going to take their land and colonize their land. They're not going to be happy, and the only way we're going to be able to stay there is to just kill as many as possible and put up an iron wall and make sure they are so scared and destroyed that they won't touch us. That's what Netanyahu called his operation in the West Bank. And who prepared that operation? It was the Palestinian Authority. There was a very good report by Miriam Barghouti, who's a journalist in the West Bank, that came out a couple of weeks ago, and she's been reporting on the PA's assault on Jenin. And they killed a journalist, they've killed countless people. And obviously, I think that there was probably some coordination with the Israelis. They said, you soften up Jenin for us and we'll come in and finish it off, which is what they're doing. But the Palestinian Authority needs to be talked about much more than is talked about, because it is a major obstacle to Palestinian liberation, because it was set up as part of the Oslo process as a way, as Laleh mentioned, to subcontract out the occupation. And it's a tactic as old as imperialism itself. You know, the colonizer creams off a native elite, gives them lots of money, weapons, trains all their personnel, and uses them to keep the natives down. And also, interestingly as well, there's 7 British military personnel permanently based in Ramallah training PA forces. This is the same government and same state that's actually been participating in the genocide in Gaza. So I think that all these things need to be dismantled as a prerequisite. But I have to say that, well, it's mixed emotions, isn't it? Because you know the power you're up against, you know the power of the Trump administration, you know the power of the US and Israel, but they have failed. And Palestine, Gaza has won. The cost has been way too high, but they've won. So I do feel like that is something we can take going forward. And as I said, the plan they have, they're in control of now, but they won't always be in control of. And part of me thinks, if you look at what the Trump administration is doing, he is unwittingly kind of destroying the US empire. Like he's defunded US aid because he's imbibed all the liberal propaganda about it being money we give to poor people. And obviously he doesn't like that, but that is liberal propaganda. US aid is actually a part of the tapestry of the US empire. So anyone on the left who's an anti-imperialist should support the defunding of US aid. And I feel like that's the same with his general foreign policy, even attacking Iran. Like the reason the US hasn't done that for many, even George Bush didn't do it, George W. Bush, was because it will unleash forces that they're not ready for. There was a famous interview of Obama where they were asking him why he hadn't attacked Iran. He was like, look, he didn't put it in these terms, but this is basically what he said. He said, look, we've destroyed Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan. At least in Iran, I know who to call, someone's in charge of the country. We haven't done that. We haven't destroyed it to that point yet. And that's, he wanted to keep it out of that chaos of empire that the US has created. So if Trump unleashes that, I think that there will be a fertile ground for really damaging the US empire in the Middle East. And I'll finish with this. I think that's the key of this, is that Israel is an arm of the US empire and is a colony of the United States. It's a small country, 9 million people, smaller than this city. It's smaller than Wales geographically. It couldn't operate for a week without the US. So we need to understand that when we talk about liberating, like Palestinian liberation for the whole of the Middle East, the major enemy is the United States, because they've been dominating it and keeping in reactionary dictators for decades, and they have a lot of power. So when Palestinian liberation is predicated on the pushing back against American imperial power and British imperial power.
I think it's also really, really important to notice that some of the policies that Trump has pretty much planned, potentially an attack on Iran, potentially permitting, giving Netanyahu the green light to push Palestinians in the West Bank to Jordan, Palestinians in Gaza into Sinai, is actually going to be fought, however quietly, however obsequiously, by the Arab states, because Palestinians in Jordan and Palestinians in Sinai will undermine the stability of the authoritarian regimes there that are dependent on the US for their survival. An attack on Iran would probably it actually probably terrifies, the possibility of it terrifies the Al Saud regime in Saudi Arabia and all of the Arab states in the Gulf, because exactly what you're saying is that this would unleash a kind of a perhaps from ground up forms of attack against these long-standing authoritarian states that have been supported by the United States, which it simply cannot afford. Now, Trump may want to do this. You know, he is an ignorant doofus. But there is also, it's important to recognize that despite the fact that he is acting like he is an emperor, the machinery of the US empire is a machinery, and there are constraints on this. So an attack against Iran, for example, would require the acquiescence of the Pentagon. And I'm sure, I am certain that there are people in the Pentagon, well, there are some that are going to be like Dr. Strangelove, but then there are others in the Pentagon which are going to want to put some brakes on, because they don't want to have to face the Iranian government, whose military is not the Iraqi military, it's not the Syrian military, and it's not the unconventional forces of a Hezbollah or Hamas. They are a massive, powerful, incredibly experienced military. So it is something to also watch out for, is those quiet internal dissent within the authoritarian regimes that the US supports in the region.
If I can just add, there's a very interesting statement that was made by a guy called Lawrence Wilkerson, who was chief of staff to Colin Powell, both when he was America's most senior military officer. He was chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff before he became Secretary of State, and Wilkerson, a former Marine, was his chief of staff when he was Secretary of State as well. And he says on Iran, as Tony Zinni said, former Central Command commander, if you liked Iraq, you'll love Iran. That is a 10 to 14 year, $3 to $4 trillion invasion, at the end of which the world, Western Asia, will look not much different than it does right now. It'll still be in turmoil, still be in chaos, and 70+ million Iranians, 52 or 53% of cohesive Persians, will hate our living guts. So I think to emphasize the point that even within the machinery of empire, there will be dissenting voices who realize that this would be total madness.
I just wanted to move on a bit, because we're talking about Trump and the Middle East. So just talking about Trump, I mean, the phenomenon of Trump, I don't know if he is actually kind of a representative of the military-industrial complex, or is he some kind of philosopher king? I mean, a kind of cod philosopher king. It's hard to judge. I mean, we're talking about Trump. We're personalising this whole thing. What's your view about Trump, Jeremy? Do you think he's just a representative of the industrial military complex?
I think it's too easy to just condemn Trump and point to his character and deficiencies and so on. He's actually a deeply calculating individual, and this is all planned out. Quite a lot of it is an act from which he pulls back quite often. Hence the stuff today and yesterday about tariffs on Canada and Mexico and the European Union, and China and Colombia and any other country that comes to mind, it might well be that he will then say, well, he's had undertakings from them about X, Y, and Z, and will pull back on it. It's, to him, it's a political calculation. But it's not without its risks, because, in effect, the tariffs he's put on are a tax on the United States citizens and will cause food prices, etc., to rise. And when the food doesn't come in from Mexico, when the car parts don't come in from Canada, he's got then problems of high food prices in the USA and layoffs in the car industry and every other industry, many of those areas that actually supported him in the election. So you kind of wonder, is this really well thought out, or is this a lot of bluff that's going on? In the case of what's happening in the Middle East, I think his fundamental thing is that he's there to support and maintain Israel in its current form, and therefore, when I say its current form, that is the current form and the determination of the Israeli political system to essentially eliminate Palestine in its entirety. But as Matt pointed out, it simply hasn't happened and hasn't worked. They haven't succeeded in removing the entirety of the population of Gaza out of the Gaza Strip. And whilst they have upped the numbers of settlements and people moving in the West Bank, they haven't managed to annex the West Bank in the way that they wanted. And so the question I ask myself, and I'm sure many in this room does as well, what about all the neighbouring countries that seem more interested in having a close relationship with Trump and following the Abraham Accords, a deal with Israel at the expense of the Palestinian people? And that surely is where the question of international solidarity comes in, and why what we do politically in this country is important, because Britain has many historical responsibilities, one of which was the issue about the way in which the Nakba took place and the way in which the relationship with Israel has developed ever since then. But we also have this key role in militarily facilitating the US in what it's doing there at the present time. So there's a lot of work we've got to do as well in this country. But I have to say, I mean, I've been in Parliament throughout all these years, and there was a time when if you just used the word Palestine in the chamber, there'd be sort of points of order immediately about raising this subject and where is it, what is it, and things like that. Yeah, seriously, I'm not joking, it's absolutely serious what was happening. And then up until October 23, that carried on to some extent. And then after that, anyone that called for a ceasefire was deemed to be a lackey of somebody or other, and those of us that did. And then the big demonstrations took place, then the demands took place, and 2 weeks later, I could hardly get into the questions to the Foreign Secretary for all these other Labour MPs saying they'd now seen the light and now were calling for a ceasefire. And every one of them included in their remarks about a ceasefire. And I could just see the effect of the demonstrations on people's opinions. Now, if people understand that you can influence things, then it's a question of going out and doing it. That is why so much effort has been put in, particularly by the Home Office, in placing the Metropolitan Police in a position where they try to prevent our demonstrations taking place. So it has become an argument also about free speech and the right to demonstrate within our own society. But remember this, the BDS bill that they put in the last Parliament didn't go through. It's not law. It's not there. The demand for a ceasefire is now officially supported by the UK government. There were 30 arms licenses suspended. I can't for the life of me find out what these licenses are. For all I know, they might be high-vis vests or something. I've no idea what they are, because it's impossible to find it out. And believe me, a lot of people have tried very hard. There are still, 100 or more than that, several hundred.
It was 8%,
yeah,
but like you say, they haven't released what they were.
Yeah, there's a lot more are still in place. But the disinvestment by local authorities has had some effect. It's a bit like sanctions on South Africa. It wasn't sanctions and it wasn't international demonstrations that ended the apartheid regime in South Africa, but those demonstrations did help, and I'm sure Andrew would confirm this, to isolate the regime and to create a sense of hope amongst the anti-apartheid campaigners in South Africa that they were not alone. There was solidarity around the world, and that's why what we do in our own way is actually very important.
It's very interesting, you know, your question about Trump and the military-industrial complex. When he came to office the first time, one would have assumed, being a businessman who'd been declared bankrupt 7 times, with a history of quite severe corruption in his business dealings, that he would be attracted to the military-industrial complex, because the global arms trade is the most corrupt of all trades, accounting for 40% of all corruption in global trade. But interestingly, when he first came to office, he was actually quite cynical about the military-industrial complex, to the point that he threatened to pull money from the F-35 project, because he believed that the F-35, actually quite correctly, which is the most expensive weapons system ever built, didn't work, according to US Defense Inspector General. And the jet just doesn't work. Its combat suite, the brains of the thing, don't work. But then I think when he realized the extent of the corruption, and given the way he conducts both his personal and his business life, that was obviously appealing to him and his family, he suddenly became a big convert to the F-35. And he gave this extraordinary news conference in which he was talking about the F-35 and its stealth capabilities. And this is where the act comes into it that Jeremy mentioned. You know, he was talking about the fact, when I can't remember who the other pilot was, whether it was Russian, Chinese, North Korean, whoever the enemy of the moment was. You know, when the Russian, Chinese pilot is flying next to the F-35, he actually can't see it. It's invisible, which is what he thought a stealth jet was. A stealth jet means it can't be picked up by radar, but the bloody thing is still there with all its metal. And of course, now he has bought into the whole military-industrial complex thing. But the most bizarre thing about that is the way in which the military-industrial complex functions, what a brilliant Pentagon whistleblower called the self-licking ice cream, because it sort of perpetuates itself all the time. It doesn't actually require all of these conflicts, because, you know, the Starmers, the Trumps, the Bidens, the Scholzes of this world, whether they're real threats or not, they're going to create the threats. Going to an arms fair is just this sort of orgy of fear that is created about everything that is about to hit us all as, you know, the civilized white Western world, and how we have all of the weaponry and equipment that's going to save us. And, oh, by the way, it's going to cost you hundreds of billions of dollars. Because what this industry does is it turns public money into private profits. That's its real function in neoliberal capitalism. And I think that Trump understands that, but it doesn't actually need the conflict. I want to very quickly make one other point, referencing something that Jeremy said. You know, about the role of the sanctions movement in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. I think it was important at 2 levels. I think the symbolic level was incredibly important. For people in Soweto and Sharpeville and Boipatong to just feel that tens, if not hundreds of millions of people around the world knew about them and what they were suffering was really, really important during the darkest days of apartheid. But it also did play a role in destroying the South African economy, together with wave upon wave of industrial strike in apartheid South Africa itself, and huge numbers of South Africans making the country ungovernable. Because what really led to the end of apartheid was when the South African economy, the economy that affected white standards of living, started to deteriorate very rapidly. That's when even F.W. de Klerk, who was on the right wing of the party of apartheid, realized the game was up. And the very important thing to bear in mind at the moment, the Israeli economy has tanked. Intel halted a $25 billion investment in Israel. And that's one of the few that has become public. There have been a hell of a lot others who just believe, thinking in the way that they think, that Israel is no longer a good investment destination for their funds. And my feeling is that despite being declared bankrupt 7 times, Donald Trump knows enough about the workings of an economy to know that the United States of America cannot afford to bail out the Israeli economy without the American economy itself taking some very hard blows. And I think that's why focused pressure, BDS pressure, on Israel is more important than it's ever been at the moment. Because if anything is going to bring about change, it's not going to be, unfortunately, our moral and ethical arguments. It's going to be the degradation of the day-to-day life of the majority of Israelis who support their government.
Matt, what do you think about Trump as an individual? Do you think he has power above anyone? I mean, is he different to Biden in a major way? Is he more of a threat or less of a threat to the Middle East?
I think he's more of a threat. I mean, we have some evidence because he has been president before, right? And when he was president before, he was the most pro-Israel president probably since the Second World War, well, since Israel was created in 1948. I mean, there was one...
Other than Biden.
Well, if he had been in the White House during the genocide, I'm sure he'd have done the same thing. But yeah, okay, in terms of supporting the genocide. But in terms of doing things that were red lines even for the Democrats, like in 2018 he moved the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which only a few countries have done and is a contravention of international law. He did that at the time when he'd probably collaborated with the Israelis and said you can take out all the protesters in Gaza that were marching to the prison walls during the Great March of Return. That happened contemporaneously with the opening of the embassy in Jerusalem. So, and just look at the personnel around him. To be honest with you, I don't think he has convictions. I think that he does what's good for him, he does what's good for power. And everyone around him now is a Israel nut. So he's going to be doing what he's told, and he's close to Netanyahu. It's kind of like Keir Starmer as well. I don't think Keir Starmer has politics. He's just a void that gets filled by different interests and people around him. And in fact, a lot of politicians, unfortunately, are like that in our country and the United States. One noble exception next to me, so I think that, but I think he's extremely dangerous because, he is willing. He's also got maybe rhetoric, but it might not be what he's talking about: annexing Greenland, invading Panama to take control of the Panama Canal. This shouldn't be taken lightly. This is the most powerful man in the world with the most powerful military that has ever existed in human history. You can do these things very easily. And the US did invade Panama in 1989 on very thin pretexts. So I think he's very dangerous. But then again, as Laleh says, like with Biden, look at Biden. He's a Democrat, and he oversaw the genocide for 15 months. And it goes to the heart of a much bigger issue in our societies, in that we don't live in a democracy. It's a complete illusion that we have a democratic system here or in the United States. You know, the Democrats and the Republicans are both parties of the empire. They're both parties of what's called the deep state, the federal bureaucracy, whatever you want to call it, the permanent government that stays the same, that is impervious to what happens in the White House. And that's what we need to change. And in fact, if you look at the election, I think it's become very exposed with the genocide in Gaza. If you look at the election in the United States, you had Biden, who had supported the genocide, and Kamala Harris, who had supported the genocide for over a year. You had Trump, who had supported it rhetorically and was likely to carry on supporting Israeli attacks on Palestinians. Here you had Starmer, who carried on doing what Rishi Sunak had done. I mean, in fact, I was covering the British role in Gaza during the handover of power in July, and there was basically zero changed. And that's another facet of this. When I say there's no democracy, that is true for domestic issues mainly, but in foreign policy it's total. Like, their foreign policy operates completely off the books of what happens in Parliament. everything stays the same. Our support for the Gulf dictatorship stays the same. Our support for Israel stays the same. And it's a major problem. And one of the major reasons that we can't take it on is because no one knows, because we're fed the illusion I'm talking about from when we're very, very young. If you open any newspaper, it's assumed we live in a democracy. It's assumed Labour and Tory are think two opposing things, and they duke it out based on principled lines. But what Parliament is pantomime for the plebs. Sorry, Jeremy. But, I mean, you're not part of it, but I do think that, that one of the big realizations we need to, and actually, I'll finish with this because Jeremy's here. I actually thought this before Jeremy was elected leader of the Labour Party, and then when Jeremy was elected, I was like, well, maybe I was wrong about this. Look, the Labour Party can be used as a vehicle for change in Britain. But in hindsight now, if you look at what happened during Jeremy's leadership of the Labour Party, there were obviously many elements of the British establishment which worked to bring him down. But the Labour Party itself was one of the major reasons Jeremy didn't become Prime Minister in 2017. If he hadn't been fighting a guerrilla war against his own party, or they hadn't been fighting against him for 2 years, he would have been Prime Minister in 2017. So what does that tell you? That Labour Party's role in our polity is to absorb and neutralise the left. And actually, for the honchos in the Labour Party, Jeremy was more of a, Labour under Jeremy was much more of a threat to them than the Tories getting into government. And it came out subsequently in 2017, there was a headline in The Independent that said Labour officials were actively working to stop Labour winning the election. I don't know of any other occasion in a Western democracy where that's happened, or I haven't seen it. So hopefully, like I think many awakenings have happened over the past 15 months about US power, about democracy, about what our leaders are willing to do to project their power. Hopefully we can crystallize all those, and actually they won't evaporate, and the general awakening will be permanent, and we can actually move towards having a world based on justice and peace, which is what people like Keir Starmer say they want, but work to do the opposite.
Jeremy, did you want to say something?
Yeah, very briefly, then I hope we can have some more questions and discussion about Palestine. A couple of things. One is that the total votes cast in the 2017 and 2019 elections were the highest votes this century that the Labour Party received, despite all the opposition and 90% of media being hostile to what we were saying and what we were doing. Secondly, whilst I fully acknowledged I received a lot of opposition from a lot of people within the party and elsewhere, the biggest opposition actually was not so much around the proposals that I was pushing forward of public ownership of utilities and so on, and workers on the board and all the other economic and social justice arguments we're putting forward. I can't pretend that the business community as a whole wanted any of that, but they felt they could live with it. I mean, they felt, okay, we don't really like all this, but what the real opposition I got was actually on international issues and foreign policy, because they knew perfectly well what my instincts were, what direction I would want to go, and what role we would play. And it would be the first time you'd have a British government that did not support the idea of occupation, that did not support the principles behind so much of the British colonial imperative over many decades. I mean, it always puzzled me, maybe it doesn't anymore. 1945 to 51 Labour government achieved incredible things in domestic policies. You can't take it away from them. National Health Service, housing, public ownership, and so on. Good stuff. Yet that same government marched into Vietnam in 1945 to protect the colony until the French could get there and take over the fight against the Viet Minh. That same government went into Indonesia and did exactly the same thing until the Dutch arrived to reclaim their colony. That same government took part in the suppression of uprisings in Malaysia. And then in the 1950s, the attacks on the Kenyan people and the use of concentration camps against Kenyan people was all carried out. And so it's the traditions and that's hardwired into the whole foreign policy set up in Britain And I just finished this, I've gone for a long time about this because I've been writing about it in my book. You can buy it next year, or later this year. Hope people sell it out there. It is that the whole point of the foreign policy is that it's a continuation between one government and another, and the accountability on foreign policy in Parliament is very limited. The first vote on a war was actually at the start of the Iraq War in 2003, when Blair, I'm never sure whether he wanted the vote in order to give himself legitimacy or he felt pushed into it. I'm really not sure. But they did take a vote on approving the government going into Iraq when we had 149 Labour MPs voted against, but it still went through on Tory and other support. But I had already drafted to go into power with a War Powers Act, which would have insisted on any deployment of British forces anywhere being subject to a parliamentary vote. That's been completely dropped by Starmer as soon as he became leader of the party. All those kind of mechanisms that we were putting in place. And so our struggle goes on in a way of education and mobilisation of people. But I tell you this, 5 of us were elected to Parliament as independents, largely because of Gaza and our attitudes on that. And there is a whole community out there that want to see and do understand the importance of having a much different and much better approach to foreign policy. I don't want the next generation to go into war in Ukraine, the Middle East, or anywhere else. I want to see a world at peace where we don't send young people out to war to kill each other in battlefields. It is about solving problems by looking at the rights of people to live in peace and justice, and that includes the Palestinian people.
Now, I'd like to find out a bit more about Trump's position on Saudi Arabia and on Iran. Would you like to say what you think about this, Laleh?
So it's interesting because Trump is at once a businessman, a showman. I mean, he was like the Alan Sugar of whatever that television show, The Apprentice, in the US. And he is the head of the enormous machinery of the US government. And while most other presidents do some degree of insulation of those roles from one another, it's almost impossible to tell at any given moment whether Trump is being the showman or he's being a businessman who's worried about his own businesses, or he's acting on behalf of the sort of the larger US empire. We know that in the first administration that he actually had made all sorts of deals with Mohammed bin Salman, the enfant terrible of Saudi Arabia, the crown prince, Prince Bonesaw. And he was, he was quite happy. Trump was quite happy to send his son-in-law to Saudi Arabia to set up a Trump hotel. He was quite happy, actually, to approve, for example, Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates, instituting a boycott against Qatar. And in fact, had even signaled to Saudi Arabia that they're welcome to invade until I think the Pentagon or his generals told him, dude, this is where the CENTCOM army bases. You can't have Saudis invade Qatar. And so I think that there is some degree of, shading between his personal interests and state reasons that goes on with him. And it's not always completely clear where the line is and what the limits are. It's not clear who is going to stop him at any given time from doing kind of crazy stuff that is completely and totally driven by his own personal impetus. Some of the people that were saying that part of the reason that there was actually a deal between Lebanon and Israel to have a ceasefire was because he has another son-in-law who is Lebanese. He's a Lebanese Christian, and he's a Lebanese Maronite. And so they were saying that maybe that's why, because obviously a lot of the villages that are in southern Lebanon are not only Shia, but there are also actually a huge population of those are also Maronite Christians. And so there was some talk that maybe it was this personal intervention that did it. It doesn't matter. I mean, I don't think that those things are significant, but I do think what is significant is that he is the head of perhaps the single most malignant empire in human history, with all of the machinery of that empire at his fingertips. And he will do what he thinks will make him popular, but he'll also be pushed forward to put into place policies that have been long-standing policies of the United States. The support for Israel is not because he has a particular love of Israel. He's actually known to have been a terrible anti-Semite and has said all sorts of really shitty stuff about Jewish people in his earlier time. The reason that he continues to support Israel is because, as actually Biden said, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it.
Yeah.
As Reagan's Secretary of Defense said, Israel is the greatest, most unsinkable stationary aircraft the United States has had. I mean, it is, if we think of Israel as being a kind of a militarized Texas on the Mediterranean, US support for that state makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Now, if we do look at it in that way, that means that whatever position that Trump takes vis-a-vis Iran is going to be actually not so much about Iran, about which he probably knows very little. If they show him a picture of Quiche Island, he'll probably immediately want to put up a Trump Tower or Trump Resort there. But the point is that he looks at that in relation to Israel and in relation to Saudi Arabia, which is the closest ally that it has among the Arab states. And so I think that on the one hand, he personally knows nothing, doesn't care anything, except as far as Israel is concerned. But on the other hand, there's, again, the machinery of empire behind him, pushing him towards what may potentially be an attack against Iran, unless there is internal dissent within the administration, and especially within the Pentagon, against any kind of all-out attack.
The best description I had of Trump was I was in Washington in 2015 lobbying to support people in Guantanamo Bay to get the place closed down. And this was when Trump was likely to be the Republican candidate. And somebody said to me, he said, look, don't worry about it. He'll simply buy the place and turn it into a golf course and the prison will be finished. They just thought he was just purely transactional, how wrong they were.
Yeah. I want to make a point about Saudi. But before I do that, another point you make really makes me think about the complete ignorance of many of our political leaders about this part of the world. I mean, Jon Snow tells the story of interviewing Tony Blair as the invasion of Iraq happened, and, you know, talking to him about what a huge step this was and the anxiety it must provoke, etc., etc. And in the conversation, Snow made reference to Iran, and specifically to Mossadegh, and Britain's role in overthrowing this democratically elected Iranian leader. Tony Blair's response was, "What's Mossadegh?" Which is really terrifying when they're making the sort of decisions that they're making. I also feel I probably should as a South African, and we deserve a lot of praise for what we've done at the ICJ. But we also owe the world an apology. I mean, Elon Musk is a creature of apartheid South Africa. I mean, we were ruled after the Second World War by neo-Nazis who actually had been jailed during the Second World War because of their Nazi sympathies. And clearly, the young Musk imbibed too much of this neo-Nazism. You know, it wasn't just enough the bloody Nazi salutes, but he has to go off and be the main speaker at the AfD rally in Germany. It's quite extraordinary, just in case anybody didn't understand the Nazi salutes. It really is shocking. It's just a great pity that he and his family fled before Mandela became president. What I wanted to say about Saudi Arabia is we shouldn't forget that before Gaza, from March of 2015, our government, and particularly the American government, had supported Saudi Arabia in the way that they've supported the Israelis in the ongoing carnage they were committing in Yemen. Yeah. And that was really the start of the destruction of any sort of international rule of law, where the West decided that, you know, what's Yemen? If the Crown Prince wants to bomb it to smithereens, we're going to make money from that, and we'll get strategic advantage for it in relation to Iran, etc., etc. And, you know, Yemen is yet again one of those examples of just how unproductive and unsuccessful Western foreign policy is based on our ignorance. The reality, you know, who runs most of Yemen today? It's the Houthis. Who was stopping the shipping going through the Red Sea in case any of it went to Israel? It was the Houthis, who had more impact on global trade than the Americans have had in a long while. Yeah. So it's almost ironic. And this was a policy, you know, it was Obama who first supported the Saudi role in Yemen. Trump, of course, intensified that, as did Biden. So, you know, I'm not sure it matters that much what party they're from, as Matt suggests. I mean, anybody who thinks that my constituency member of parliament, Keir Starmer, is leader of anything resembling a Labour Party just hasn't been paying attention. You know, I often feel that if his parents had called him Margaret, he would have been a Tory. So we should blame his parents that we got stuck with him in the Labour Party. I mean, and as Matt said, you know, the guy has absolutely no politics. But exactly like Claire Short said of Tony Blair, he's never seen a war or an arms deal that he doesn't like. These people are literally reared, and I can say this as being from the colonies. You know, these people are reared to be agents of the British establishment state. And that's exactly what Starmer's doing, and it's what the last however many American presidents have done.
Yeah, I'll just add on the Gulf dictatorships, the 6 Gulf dictatorships, which are, many of them were installed by the British, actually. And the Saudi one was installed by the British in the 1930s and has been propped up by us and the us first, then the Americans took over after the Second World War. There was a famous meeting between President Roosevelt and Ibn Saud, where they basically said, you're ours now. And the British got Iran. That's how they divvied up the oil after the Second World War. But just a good example of what Jeremy's talking about, the foreign policy that operates in a bipartisan way and just stays the same through the whole, whoever's in number 10. In 1964, the British military embedded 11 soldiers in the Saudi military, a part of the Saudi military called the White Army, which is like the personal protection force of the House of Saud. And they're still there. They're still there, and their job is to help the Saudi dictatorship see off any democratic threats to their rule. So we're actively keeping that dictatorship in power, and so are the Americans. And it goes for Bahrain, where the 5th Fleet is. It goes for Qatar, where Al Udeid base is, the biggest US base in the whole of the Middle East. And it goes to the heart of the issue, which is we don't care about dictators. In fact, we love dictators if they do what they're told. The only time we care is if the dictator stops doing what they're told, which is what a recent case which has become an issue recently was President Assad in Syria, who was a brutal dictator, don't get me wrong. I was in Syria in 2009 and had a friend that was put in Sednaya prison. I know all about what Assad did, but he wasn't targeted by the CIA, MI6, the French, for the fact he was a brutal dictator. He was targeted because he wasn't doing what he was told. And actually, interestingly, the biggest CIA covert operation since Operation Cyclone, which was the one that they did in Afghanistan when bin Laden was on the CIA payroll in the 80s, but the biggest one after that was Operation Timber Sycamore, which was an operation the CIA put $1 billion a year into try and overthrow Assad and arming all those people that are now in power. But Trump actually stopped that. He stopped the Operation Timber Sycamore in 2017. So it's like Laleh says, it's difficult to know with Trump because he's unconventional and he does things unwittingly. But I find him impossible to read. But one thing is certain: the blob, which is what they call the sort of deep state in Washington, doesn't like him, because they want predictability. You know, they want these identikit politicians like Obama, like Biden, and Trump. That is an unknown quantity. He does things that he for reasons that he's not even aware of that might damage American power. But so the relationship with Saudi, I think Mohammed. But again, another realization I think many people have had about. From Gaza is the role of the Gulf states and the Muslim world in supporting the Zionist project, because they've done nothing for the Palestinians. In fact, Malaysia and Yemen. Malaysia, yeah, I was going to come to that. But I'm talking about the Gulf states particularly. If you look at, and Jordan as well, Jordan actually shot down rockets, Iranian rockets that were heading towards Israel. Madness. And then MBS was quoted in that recent book saying, "I don't give a shit about the Palestinians," privately to some American officials. And I think that they don't care. And actually, there's another rumor that Hamas launched the October 7th attacks because of the normalization process that was going to be signed between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So, and I think that will be revitalized. You know, the Abraham Accords. Jared Kushner is going to be the Trump's point guy again for the Middle East. So, yeah, it's not looking good. But again, Trump is a vulgar but more honest version of what we represent, and although is represented. Like, it doesn't matter who's in number 10, it doesn't matter who's in the White House. We have always supported the Wahhabi extremists in Riyadh. That's how it works. The only good thing is, I think the liberal elite are more inclined to criticize our relationship with Saudi, for example, when someone like Trump is. They'll ignore it most of the time, but it's much easier for them if Trump's saying, you know, didn't he say like Sisi was his favorite dictator, or MBS was, yeah. You're not meant to say that. Like, even if you think it, but Biden wouldn't say that, but Trump says it, and then the liberals can get excited about it. But yeah, I think that a lot of energy is expended on trying to present Trump as this completely alien concept to American and Western power, but he's not. He's just a vulgar, more honest representation of it. And I think for that we should be thankful, because our enemy is much clearer. And the US empire, as Laleh said, is one of the most brutal empires in history. It's definitely the most powerful empire in history. So the more people that have realization about how it works and what it represents is a good thing for humanity.
Yeah, I found that really interesting about, you know, they need to, if Trump wants to go to war with Iran, he's got to mobilize the West in support of him, but all these liberals don't like him, so he's quite good for that reason. But
except for the fact that Hakeem Jeffries of the Democratic Party yesterday or today went in front of a crowd and complained about the fact that Trump was not moving fast enough in bombing Iran.
Oh, well, that hope lasted about 10 seconds.
But also, the other thing you should just mention on the Iran-Trump point is he did something crazy in 2020 when he was president in his first time. He assassinated General Soleimani from the IRGC. I mean, that in Iraq as well. It's unheard of. That is a declaration of war. You can't assassinate a top general in a state's military and it not be a declaration of war. So, and that was probably that was done in collaboration with Israel. That was probably Israel probably asked. I think it actually came out that Israel asked him to do that. But I think Iran is the one that's going to get hit unless we can stop it. Of course, we can stop it. We probably stopped it with the anti-war movement in 2003. The fact it was so big made it harder for them to move on to Iran. But it's definitely been an obsession of the neocons and definitely Netanyahu since the 1990s.
I mean, with that in mind, I mean, it is a lot about PR campaigns to get people to fight wars, to get people behind them. And we're seeing with the social media companies a real control of any dissent from their line. Is that a concern for how they could drum up support for a war? Andrew, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we mustn't lose sight of the role of big tech in our societies because they are so profoundly important. It's also really important. I'm working on a book at the moment called Making a Killing, How the West Profits from Slaughter in Gaza and Yemen. And to look at the ownership of the defense companies, the companies that defend our borders from the so-called hordes who come here from the places where we drop bombs that we're making money from. But then, crucially, these same venture capital firms, private equity firms, are exactly the same ones who are invested in all of the big media and tech businesses around the world. And it's actually the financial infrastructure that sits behind a lot of our economies that I think we need to look at far more closely in terms of how the process of going to war actually gets normalized in our societies. And on that, I just wanted to say something about what Matt said about Trump. You know, I had the dispiriting experience. I was talking to a friend of mine who was one of the founders of something called Breaking the Silence in Israel, who are these Israeli combatants who sort of speak, although anonymously, about immoral orders they've been given. And I was talking to him, and he was saying to me, when Netanyahu won one of his elections, I can't remember which one, I was sort of devastated. And he said to me, no, it's actually better if someone like Netanyahu is in power, because he is sort of the unvarnished, uncontrolled face of the reality of Israeli power. You know, he doesn't have the sort of PR edifice of a Rabin or a Perez or any of those much slicker operators. And there is something to that, because it does expose the real extremity of our political systems when you see it in this unvarnished form. And it does mean that there can be some liberal outrage against the worst excesses of our systems. But it's also really important to bring it home. And, you know, we look at who the biggest contributors were to the Labour Party's election coffers in this last election. Trevor Chin is Jewish Leadership Council. Gary Labner, another bloody South African, billionaire who, you know, he has no real interest in politics besides ensuring there's no wealth tax and that there's no criticism of Israel. Gave the Labour Party £5.5 million. But then far more important than that was the private equity firm that gave them millions and millions and millions that's invested in what? Fossil fuel companies and defense companies. So why do we think they're approving the extension of the Heathrow runway? Why do we think that they're doing nothing meaningful about the climate catastrophe that we face? And why do we think that in their first budget, in which all sorts of benefits get cut back, in which we see what happens with the winter fuel allowance, we see the two-child benefit cap not being removed, we see just a continuing plunging of investment in the NHS, in education, etc., etc. £3 billion extra on the defense budget. It's a very simple exercise of following the money. And unfortunately, in politics, it's all about the money. And that money serves a whole range of purposes. That's how you fund your political party, one. But two, that's how you fund your own lifestyle. And I don't mean the cheapskate Keir Starmer getting some van rental company to pay the £5,500 when he was forced last summer to have a family holiday in England rather than in Italy or Spain where he normally goes. You know, this guy's a multimillionaire, but he can't pay for his own family holiday amongst all those other things. But let us never forget, in America, it's a system of legalized bribery. We can actually look at how much each politician gets from the defense sector, the fossil fuel sector, the financial sector, et cetera, and what they give them in return when they're in office. In this country, it's supposed to be illegal. But it happens in just the same way it happens in the United States of America. And the best example of that is Tony Blair. I estimate incredibly conservatively that since leaving office, Tony Blair has made in excess of £110 million personally out of the companies that benefited most from the decision to invade Iraq and from his association with BAE Systems, with whom he corrupted the world, including my own country of South Africa, 4 years into our new democracy. So it's almost as though being Prime Minister of this country is like a job interview to become a multimillionaire or a billionaire with various American, British, and other companies. That is the state of our politics. And the sooner we realize that, is the sooner we can fundamentally change the structures and the functioning of our political system in this country. Oh. And I better say, otherwise I'm going to be in big trouble with Laura. I think all of our books are being sold outside. There's one I have to mention, which is a book that we did with Jeremy with the Peace and Justice Project recently, called Monstrous Anger of the Guns: How the Global Arms Trade is Ruining the World, and this is the important part, and what we can do about it. And it's got some incredible chapters by activists from all over the world who are working against militarism and the arms trade and the impacts it's having in their own continent and countries.
Thanks. I just want to follow what Andrew said. The book is obviously available here, but it's also, we're doing events on it all over the country. We've done quite a lot already. Very large audiences come, and it becomes then a discussion about role in the world. It becomes a discussion about defense policy and the corruption that goes with the arms industry. And Andrew is right that the government is proposing to raise defence expenditure to 2.5% of GDP. That's hardwired into the budget. There are now serious moves in Parliament to put it up to 3%, as well as continuing development of the new nuclear missile system. And so we, at the same time, last week, Parliament voted to the benefit cap to go through, the welfare cap rather, to go through, which prevents welfare spending rising significantly over the next 5 years, and hardwires in, bakes into the policy, the continuation of the two-child benefit cap and the loss of the winter fuel allowance and the limiting of increases in disability benefits. That's going to come up again tomorrow in Parliament. So we have a sort of open door of increasing arms expenditure, and we have a closed door where you're talking about the poverty created by a benefit system that drives so many families, particularly families with large families, into the most desperate poverty. So we need to have those fundamental campaigns about what are we for? Are we for being a military power around the world on behalf of the USA, or are we serious about improving living standards and having a role in the world that achieves something different? So the meetings that we've been doing have been absolutely fascinating for the number of people that come and the intensity of those discussions. We're doing a lot more of them, and we're building up, with Andrew and many others, a whole network of like-minded independents all around the country. So there is a big alternative political voice growing very, very fast all over this country, and I hope you'll all be part of it.
Now, I was just going to ask you, Jeremy, but you can speak about this as well, maybe, about the alternative, the Brics, possibly, in this Hague group. I mean, that we can set up alternatives to Western imperialism. Is there hope in that?
Well, the BRICS group is significant and very important because it is promoting a trade system which doesn't depend on the dollar. And that's why the USA is so upset about it, because it won't be dollar trading done by the BRICS countries. And now, the BRICS countries are a pretty mixed bag, to be quite honest. I mean, you've got the original Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, now joined by a number of others, Saudi Arabia, etc. And so it's not as if there's necessarily a political hard core to it, but it is an alternative form of trading. And I was talking to Dilma Rousseff about this, who is the essentially running the bank that the BRICS countries have set up. And she said, look at it this way, Jeremy, this is a way of non-European and North American countries who produce the majority of the world's resources and wealth and contribute to the food supply of North America and Europe actually having a say. It's more like the whole oil crisis of the 1970s when OPEC was founded, and it's in that sort of principle that she's looking at it. So I think it's a very interesting time, and I think one should look at what the developments that are going on there, because we're told that China is the new threat to the whole world and so on. And I was accused in Parliament of being sympathetic to the Chinese setting up bases around the world. And my reply was, so far as I'm aware, they've got one possible thing you could describe as a base, and the last time I looked, the US had 900. So they've got a long way to go to catch up with that. But the other thing is they show no intention of doing that. And what's the West doing but building up a tension in the South China Sea through the AUKUS Pact, which puts nuclear weapons into Australia, as well as nuclear submarines going all around the South China Sea. Well, this is madness. This is utter madness. Whether China and the NATO countries really want to go to war with each other, I doubt, because any rational thinker in their military planners would say, this is absurd, this is crazy. But once you've developed that sort of faux tension, mistakes happen. Things go wrong, and suddenly weapons are fired off, and then it's a bit hard to stop it.
But, you know, the notion that Australia, which has just ordered a new aircraft carrier, which is going to cost it however many billions, could actually go to war with China, which is far and away its largest trading partner, is just an absurdity.
Australia absolutely depends on China.
Yeah. It's, I mean, there's this sort of, this complete lack of logic and rationality, even if you see the world in incredibly sort of narrow neoliberal terms, that none of this actually makes sense. And it's just sort of the bluster of politicians. But as Jeremy says, it's incredibly easy for things to go wrong, as we've seen in the Middle East, unfortunately, for decades and decades.
Yeah, on the China question, I mean, I think that whatever you think of China or whatever you think of Russia or any of those other countries, if you're an independent government or you want to use the resources of your country for your people, it's much easier for you to operate in a multipolar world, because when you have just one overbearing superpower with all the institutions which run the global system, you can only go to them for help. So for example, if you need a loan, you have to go to the IMF, which is why the US hates BRICS and hates the rise of China, because they don't want another pole for a country to organize around. A good example of that is Cuba after the Cuban Revolution in 1959. If the Soviet Union hadn't been around, there's no way that revolution would have survived, because they had another pole to organize around, whether it be intelligence, economic, whatever it is. Now, it doesn't mean you have to support the Soviet Union and its policies domestically or even foreign policy. But what it means is that a multipolar world is much better for the people of the global south and the people who want to actually have sovereign governments working in the interests of their people, not external power. In Latin America in recent years, this has been shown massively with Bolivia, Venezuela, Mexico, Cuba. All of them have benefited from the rise of China because it's been much harder for the United States to destroy them. And there was a brief period at the end of the Cold War in the 90s, which was a very bleak time for liberation movements and the left globally, because it was just resurgent capitalism enforced through an unopposed United States. I mean, the Zapatistas was 94, but that was kind of like the only thing going on. And now it's very, very different. So I think it's a good thing. And I think diversifying, especially the economic institutions, like the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and World Bank, are effectively arms of the US government. If you look at the voting system in the IMF, for example, it's by how much you put in, and the US overwhelmingly puts in more. And they have, for many, many decades, have the straitjacket that they've imposed on the developing world. And having the Brics Bank allows them another option, and they can't get smashed. So, but again, going to what Jeremy and Andrew were saying about it being madness, it is madness to go to war with China and to launch this new Cold War, and it is a total choice, because if you remember in the 2010 Osborne-Cameron government, they were actually very pro-China for good business reasons. They thought we should take advantage of the fact that China's this rising power, it's going to be the biggest economy in 20 years or whatever, and they did countless overtures to the Chinese. In fact, George Osborne went a few years into the administration to Xinjiang province to drum up support for British business. And then during COVID, actually, there's basically an intra-establishment battle between the business community and the Securocrats. The Securocrats wanted to launch a new Cold War because they believe in imperial pretensions. Britain, we don't want competitors to our power. The business community said, well, let's just ride the wave of Chinese prosperity. And it was during COVID that really changed that period. I was watching it in real time, just seeing more and more things. So you see MI5 briefing about China being the new threat, all these things that they do when they've got the signal that we need to launch this war. But you realize it's a total choice. It didn't need to happen. In fact, the Cold War, even with the Soviet Union, didn't need to happen. There was a time when the Soviet Union and the United States thought that they could coexist, and then certain people went out in Washington, and the Truman Doctrine and all that stuff. But it's all a choice, and it is madness. Even on good economic grounds, we could benefit from the rise of China. But it's not looking like that's going to happen because the imperialists won out.
So, can someone talk about how that relates to the Middle East? I mean, China and BRICS. I mean, how does that relate there? What about Iran's relationship on that?
I mean, China has a really interesting role vis-à-vis the Middle East in the sense that it actually negotiated a kind of rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia recently, and so in the last year or two. But I also think that China has another kind of an interesting role in that it has been competing actually with India to set up infrastructures that transport and logistics infrastructures in Iran, in the United Arab Emirates, in fact in the whole of the region. And they have been very, very careful about balancing their relationships with all of the different states in the region. They are not... They don't really want to compete against the US militarily. They leave a great deal of the sort of politics and the interactions between the different states to the US and to the local powers. But I do think that they are very interested in this change to the global financial system. One of the ways in which the US enforces its power, aside from the fact that it has the largest military in the world, bigger than the next 9 militaries put together, is the control of the financial system. Every time that you send the money via SWIFT, it essentially goes through US servers. The US defines those dollar-denominated trades. And I think one of the things that China has been trying to do, and again, this is one of those unexpected, unanticipated consequences of the US muscular sanctions against Iran, has been that Iran and other countries are actually looking for some other currency to denominate their trade in, because they can't, in fact, go through financial channels controlled by the US. And the Chinese yuan, the renminbi, is actually offering a possible alternative, as is the BRICS possibility of Mbridge, which is supposed to be an alternative to SWIFT. So it's really important to know that every empire in the modern times has had control over the financial systems of the world. When the British Empire, when the whole map was pink, the pound sterling was the currency through which everybody traded. And I think the big switchover to oil and to dollars actually marks the rise of the US empire. And I think that should there be an actual alternative to that dollar-denominated trade in the Middle East and elsewhere, the power, the financial power of the US will be eroded in ways that we can't even foresee its impact and echoes subsequently.
Right, I think we're running out of time, so we're going to take questions from anyone who'd like to ask our excellent panel. Oh, we've got a roving mic here. There's a couple of hands that towards the back there. Oh, one there, easy.
Thank you very much for your insights this evening to the panel. There's been recent developments following the inauguration. I wanted to ask you what your opinion is on the stability of the kind of machinery of empires, as you referred to it, of the US state institutions, departments and agencies, and what possible ramifications that could have for the Middle East and the rest of the world.
Who'd like to take that one on?
I would like to actually say something about that. I find it really interesting that the US, the Trump administration, seems to be dismantling all the consent-building institutions that the US empire uses in order to enforce its hegemony. I mean, in the first Trump administration, Trump was actually talking about leaving NATO, which he doesn't say that anymore. But it is kind of a crazy thing to say. The NATO just essentially functions as a kind of a military legitimation for whatever the US wants to do. I think the fact that they've, as I think Matt mentioned, that the US aid has been invaded by Elon Musk's little cronies, or that they're talking about shutting down aid, or they're talking about sort of foreclosing the possibility of the kind of developmental support for some of the US clients. These are all really interesting developments. Having said that, Trump really believes in a muscular empire. None of the niceties, no US aid. If we want to go and invade someplace, we will go and invade someplace. The question is, again, to what extent will the US institutions actually act as a brake? And that's difficult to tell.
Any more questions?
Should we take a few at a time?
Yeah, could I ask a little one, please? Do you think there's a chance of reviving the Iran nuclear deal? And if that's revived, what does that mean for the Palestinian people? And what would you say to the people of Iran that want the sanctions lifted?
I have a lot of family in Iran, many of whom there's no love lost between them and the regime. Some have spent time in prison there. None actually would like an attack against the country because they know what the effects of that will be. They have seen what happened next door. I have a bunch of cousins who are pharmacists and doctors, and they, some of the things that sanctions have done have been massive limitations on some very necessary medicines, for example, coming in. And so it has been quite devastating in many ways. What the sanctions have done is to turn Iran towards China, for example. So during COVID, for example, the Chinese vaccine that was invented as a kind of a competition to the ones that were being developed here was actually the one that was used extensively in the Middle East. So there has been really interesting developments around that. As to whether or not there could be a revival of the nuclear deal, I don't know. I really can't tell. I think Pezeshkian, the moderate Iranian leader, president, would love to be able to negotiate a deal. He has been in conversations. It is unclear as to whether or not that could even go forward. As for whether or not that would mean that Iran would have to cease its support for Hamas, that's an interesting question, because Iran hasn't really provided that much of a direct support in a few years, and it has been a long time actually since Iran provided any kind of direct support to Hamas. Hezbollah, on the other hand, is a different story, and as to whether or not Iran will ever agree to actually give up support for Lebanon's Hezbollah, I just can't see that happening.
Right, do you want to take a few hands? And as Andrew said, it's probably a good idea.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for Amnesty International for organizing this speech, and thank you very much for the speech of all the speakers. I'm an Iranian, and I'm actually a member of campaign for Stop the Execution in Iran. Every Saturday we have got some sort of demonstration in Trafalgar Square, and every Tuesday we have got demonstration around some part of London, and especially in front of Amnesty International. The thing is that all the speakers talked about the threat of Trump's threat against Iran, especially nuclear power. But none of the speakers talked about what sort of oppression has been put on the people in Iran since 1979 Islamic regime in Iran. Every day, many people get arrested, executed in Iran, and since 2 years ago, according to Women Life Freedom movement in Iran, every student who comes to protest in the street, all the journalists, all the lawyers, and all the webloggers who actually do something, say something against the Islamic regime of Iran, get arrested, and then they are under threatened of execution. Just wanted to know what's the interpretation of the speakers towards the atrocities that's is happening and has been happened in Iran since 43 years ago. And now all the Iranian young people are under threat because they are actually coming and in the street and then take part in the demonstration. Thank you very much.
I'll maybe take another couple of questions quickly, and then you can answer them all at once. There was a hand up somewhere here.
Thank you. Question for Laleh. Hi, by the way. Kind of maybe a continuation. There is a lot of talk in Iranian circles about Trump and his hard line on Iran might speed up the collapse of the Iranian regime. I'm not asking you to make predictions. I just wonder if that's interesting for you to talk about. Thank you.
Maybe one more.
Sorry, I didn't get that question.
Would it speed up?
Will Trump's election speed up the collapse of
Yeah,
Iran?
I think Laleh got it.
Oh, yeah, sorry, it's when I've been told. Fine.
Grand. One more hand here, and then we'll pass it back to yourselves.
Good evening. Thank you very much for this talk. It was really interesting. There was something that struck me during the talk, is that of all the people that were mentioning, they were only men, and not a single woman was mentioned in the whole talk. And this, like, raised me the question of, isn't this whole world we live in a problem of men that are fighting against each other? And also, on the other hand, the people that are growing up in this world, the young people, they have as a portrait of men who, people like Trump, Netanyahu. How can we tell young people to be someone good if we live in such a sick and problematic world? Thank you.
Who'd like to start there? Jeremy?
Okay. Great questions, first of all. Thank you. But the last question, yes, it's quite true. There's a lot of macho men around the world very busy getting ready to fight each other. But one woman in the world today managed to force a climb down from Donald Trump, and that's Claudia Sheinbaum, President of Mexico. So she got a climb down on the introduction of the tariff. Now, what comes next, I don't know, but well done her, because she just pointed out what the effect would be on Mexico, but also would the effect be on the USA. And I have to say that when their fresh fruit doesn't come, they might start complaining. Who knows? On the issues of Iran and nuclear weapons and nuclear deal, first of all, thank you for what you said about human rights in Iran, and thank you to all those that are protesting and standing up for the rights of people in Iran, because I don't want a war with Iran, but I also want there to be decent human rights and respect in Iran itself, and I do recognize and support what you're saying and what you're doing. And I remember going on a delegation to Iran in 2014 and debating a lot of these issues with the Iranian regime. And at one point they said, in response to my questions about executions and about the rights of women in Iran and about the rights of dissent and so on, they said, look, if the nuclear deal is respected, which was in the offing at that time, and the sanctions are lifted, we will happily open a human rights dialogue with other forces around the world. Now, I didn't like the idea you'd be trading human rights for something else, but the fact was they were clearly aware that many around the world who do not want a war with Iran also recognize the appalling human rights record of the regime in Iran itself. But then the other question is on nuclear weapons. Just think about it. If Israel and Iran both have nuclear weapons, remember both of them at non-proliferation conferences in the past came to a near agreement on the idea of creating a Middle East zone free of weapons of mass destruction, which would have included Israel and Iran in that deal. It didn't happen ultimately, but who in their right mind would use a nuclear weapon within the region? I mean, Israel can't bomb Palestine with nuclear weapons because it would destroy Israel. And likewise, you take it across there, it would either set off a huge nuclear conflict and a nuclear winter which would destroy much of life on the whole of the Earth, or simply destroy the area, if it's a small nuclear weapon, small-ish by the standards of nuclear weapons, across the borders. So they're actually unusable in any sense. And so I'll be interested to see what role Iran and others play in the Non-Proliferation Treaty review meetings that are being held in New York in May on this. I think it's actually quite possible there could be a new nuclear deal with Iran. Because at one point that Matt was making about Trump is, he's idiosyncratic and doesn't play to an agenda. He likes doing a deal, and he likes to be the strong man doing the deal. He might just say, okay, we'll do a deal, we'll do a deal, we'll do a deal, in return you'll buy cars or we'll buy oil or something. And so I think we've just got to keep up that pressure, and also to keep up the demand for the signing by the rest of the world's countries of the a global nuclear ban on nuclear weapons, which is supported by almost a majority of the UN member states already. And so let's not lose sight of the fact there is a massive demand for peace around the world. There is a massive solidarity movement with Palestine around the world. There is a massive number of people around the world who don't see a military solution to every issue around the world and are appalled by what's happening in the Congo, what's happening in Sudan, what's happening in Yemen and in Ukraine, and of course in the Middle East. So let's build that movement for peace.
As the woman on the panel and the Iranian, I want to answer a couple of questions. As the woman on the panel, I would have to say, looking at Ursula von der Leyen, at Annalena Baerbock, frankly, I'm not sure that having women has necessarily bettered the politics in any way at all. I mean, we're sitting in a country which had Margaret Thatcher. So, I do understand that masculinity and a masculinist politics of war making is central to all of this, but I don't think having token women leaders will actually improve anything unless there is a specific politics behind their politics. So that's one thing. What do I think about Iran? So the reason I'm sitting on this stage is because my parents were political prisoners in Iran. They were communist revolutionaries. They were then imprisoned after the revolution. I was 17 years old when I left Iran in 1985. And in part I left because I was told that I would not be able to go to university in Iran. So the reason that I left is because of that history. And I'm deeply aware of the fact that in the entirety of Iran's history, there have been, since the revolution, there have been instances of extraordinary brutality. The thing about it to recognize is that, and this has been true everywhere, is that when there is external pressure on a country where the population is deeply nationalist, they may be very politically divided, but they're very deeply nationalist, external pressure generally pushes the election, supports the election of hardliners. Every time that there has been kind of a pressure from the US, it has resulted in the election of hardliners in Iran. When Trump canceled the nuclear deal, they elected the worst, the single worst Iranian president that they had, somebody that had been personally responsible for execution orders in the immediate aftermath of the revolution. So this is something to think about, is that sanctions and external pressure doesn't function in the way in which the supporters of external violence and coercion think it does. Will the Trump election cause the collapse of the regime? I don't think that there is a kind of a direct line. I do think that if there is a change to be made, and if that change is to be lasting, it has to come from below, and it has to be the Iranian people who make that decision. And I recognize that a lot of Iranian youth are being imprisoned. Some are being subjected to extraordinary violence in the prison. A very significant number have been executed and continue to be condemned to death. But I also think that revolutions happen when we least expect them. And if it does happen, kind of like the overthrow of the Assad regime, it'll surprise even the Iranians themselves, as did Syria.
Just a couple of very quick additions to that. I mean, there's obviously a problem of patriarchy in our politics, but I think the point that's being made is that those women who tend to rise to the top, with notable exceptions, but they are the exceptions, tend to almost be as patriarchal as the men in some ways. You know, let's look at Frau Baerbock, who claims to have introduced a feminist foreign policy to Germany, but who also claims that it's okay for Israel to kill men, women, and children because it's in its own defense. Now, if that's feminism, I'm not sure any of us want to be a part of that sort of feminism, one. Let's talk about Frau von der Leyen, who is turning the EU, that was created to keep peace in Europe, into one of the most belligerent institutions in Europe and pouring billions and billions of euros into the European defense industry. But amidst all of this darkness, what gives enormous hope is actually young people. And here I think that another impact of Gaza, you were talking about some of the impacts that it's had on exposing Israel and what it really is. And I'm going to talk very locally again in Keir Starmer's own constituency. Camden Friends of Palestine is this organization of predominantly young people, many of whom have never been politically active before, who've come together around the issue of Gaza. And the work that they have done, including their weekly protest, which has been getting bigger and louder outside Keir Starmer's office almost every week. The only problem is Keir Starmer doesn't come anywhere near his own constituency. If we look at young American Jews today, an astonishingly high number, and I can't remember the exact statistic, but I was astonished. I mean, the figure just keeps on going up. But an astonishingly high number believe that America's alliance with Israel is not in America's best interests. And I think what has happened because of the nature of our politics for far too long is that young people have realized that people of my age who look like me have really effed things up and don't want to play by our rules. And that's why, and I know it sounds almost disrespectful and trite to say this at this point, the fact that young people are challenging the very foundation and bases of our politics in the so-called liberal West is an incredibly, incredibly positive thing. Yeah. You know, in the last election, we had the lowest voter turnout since universal suffrage was introduced in this country. Why? Because with the exception of the independent candidates, people didn't really have a choice. And a lot of people realized that. And then finally, let me say, taken together with the fact that, you know, I grew up in a racist apartheid state. After over 340 years of racist oligarchy, ordinary people, millions of ordinary people in South Africa, with the support of tens of millions of people around the world, brought an end to that racist oligarchy. And yes, our liberation was only a partial liberation. There's still a lot of work to do in South Africa. But the fact that we did that gives me enormous hope that we, as the masses of ordinary people, can change the world for the better.
I think we need to end there.
Right.
I just wanted to say thanks so much, all of you. You've been brilliant. And I've got another event on March the 14th happening here, looking at protecting religious minorities in Iran and the Middle East. So follow me on the Eventbrite thing and you'll get all the details about that. All right, thank you so much. There's a book signing outside.
Can we just thank our panellists for tonight? And it's very, very amazing stuff, really. And also, we've got to thank Lily for setting this up.
Thank you very much.
Lily, thank you. And people watching it on YouTube, I hope you've had a good time.
See you all on the 15th, the next Palestine demonstration.
What day?